Thank you everyone for being here with us and sharing this virtual space. Of course, I'm sure you hear this all the time. We wish we could be face to face and be in dialogue. But here we are. I am calling in from the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh lands, also known as Vancouver, Canada. And I'm excited to be here. And I wanted to thank those of you who sent in questions ahead of time. It really helped us prepare and think about what we want to talk about. It's been really exciting to engage with you that way. And a little housekeeping about the names. Are the names on your questions? Some of you, we had names with it, but because we didn't get consent, we're not going to say names. And the other part is some of the questions really overlapped thematically. So you might hear part of your question morphed in with someone else's. And that's what's happening there. We tried to get to everybody. And we'll do our best to get to some of the live ones later in a bit. And then the other piece is a more personal thing. I'm sure this will resonate with some of you. In the last year being online and doing this work, I've noticed my neurodifference doesn't thrive in this space. I need to multitask in order to listen well. And it's challenging to multitask when you're holding space on a video screen. So I sometimes, I've started to figure out that I need to multitask. So it might look like to you that I may be not listening when Nick's talking because I'm looking away or doodling or something, but I realize that I'm able to be in better conversation with the people I'm with when I do that. So I just want to ask for that access and share that with you. The other thing is that part of my neurodifference is that I have a hard time, I get very scattered when I'm put on the spot to talk. And so I will sometimes be reading off the screen or off a piece of paper to calm my nerves and center my thinking. So yeah, that's all. Thanks for the care and hospitality around that. And I hope you enjoy our talk. Hello, Nick.
Hi. Yeah, welcome everyone. And thanks, Carla, for that intro, and to Suzanne for putting all this together. And yeah, this event is free, obviously, and we're glad you're here. And if you have the means, you're also welcome to make a donation. And all donations are going to go to support the Mamtagila Rematriation Project. So the Mamtagila are Indigenous people who live on northeastern Vancouver Island, and they're in the process of reclaiming and re-inhabiting their traditional territory and resisting industrial activity. So last year, they and a bunch of their supporters built a little big house, they called it, on Lekwungen and Wasanich territory. So that's in Victoria at the southern tip of Vancouver Island. And this year, they'll be bringing the little big house up to their traditional village site. And so, yeah, for us, it's a pretty inspiring project of resurgence and resistance. And so far, this little event has raised about $400 US. And so, yeah, we're excited about that. And I put the link for their Chuffed fundraiser page in the chat. And so you can donate to this event, but if it might be easier to just go to that Chuffed page and make a direct donation. Yeah, and in terms of my own Zoom setup, I have 2 monitors going, and so you might see me looking like that because, yeah, being a digital gig economy worker over the last year, I've adapted and figured out 2 monitors works for me. And I also have a pretty angry cat. My cat got lost for a month, and he was an outdoor cat, but he's currently not allowed outdoors because he was gone for a month. And so he's kind of in open revolt about that. And so if there's a lot of loud cat screaming while I'm talking, that's what that is.
Great. And I wanted to add that I will often mute when Nick is talking because I live with a bunch of people and it can be noisy. So shall we start?
Yeah. Yeah, so the format for the next hour and a bit is We're going to really briefly say what the book is about in case there's folks who haven't read it or looked into it. Say a little bit about this title that we came up with, Decomposing Empire and Composing the Future. And then, as was mentioned, a bunch of folks already sent in questions. And so we kind of mashed some of those together and tried to put them in an order that makes sense to us. And so we're going to tackle those. And then if we have time, we'll see what other questions folks have.
Yeah. So do you want to start, Nick, or do you want to?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so the first question is, in a sentence, what's the book about? And I guess we were trying to ask this question of why is it that in the spaces, like these kind of activist spaces or social movement spaces where we're supposed to feel really alive and most free and most connected to people, why do they often feel stifling and scary and like there's a lot at stake in messing up? And how do we talk about this dynamic that a lot of people who we were in conversation with see this dynamic, but how do we talk about it without blaming individuals and making another list of bad behaviors, of things not to do and things that ways that people are messing up? And then the last thing that we were trying to do in the book is how do we hold up other ways of being together where people do really feel alive and capable of resisting and transforming themselves and allowed to mess up? How do we hold those up and talk about them without turning them into a model for people to follow, without saying, well, these people are doing it right? And so those were kind of the questions that animated starting the book project for us.
And I just wanted to add, I asked Nick to do that part because I think if people follow me on Twitter, probably every 6 months I tweet out what the book's about, and they're always completely different sentences. So, because books, ideas move and they shift. And I think that it's true for this book for me, like the ideas move and shift. So, and of course they mean different things to different people. So yeah, we'll do our best to kind of share what our thoughts are and how they've grown and shifted with the book. But at the core of it for me was to amplify the importance of relationships and sitting with each other, sitting in the trouble and holding each other up. But yeah, we'll say lots more coming up.
Yeah. So we said we'd say a bit about this title, Decomposing Empire and Composing the Future. And to be honest, it was just a fun title that we came up with. We didn't have a really thought through thing, but the other day a friend asked me to explain what we meant by empire. He was doing a reading group with some friends, and I started by saying, well, we wanted this term that was encompassing all systems of oppression, that was talking about the connections between white supremacy and colonialism, capitalism, state domination, heteropatriarchy, ableism, ageism, ecocide. So we wanted to kind of gather together and say empire is all those oppressive forces, but also to say that it's not just something that's imposed on us. So that we were trying to get at the way, and this is why affect was so important in our thinking, was we wanted to think about how it makes us desire and live and love in certain ways. And in trying to say more in this conversation with my friend, I found myself talking about music and rhythm. And so we kind of ran with that. And I would say empire is like a rhythm that makes us dance in certain ways and makes it really hard to dance in other ways. So this little thing that we're doing is a series of metaphors about sound. And I want to acknowledge that not everyone hears, but everyone does move and everyone experiences rhythm and patterns. And so there's some sound specific words in here in this kind of riff that we're doing, but we want to encourage people to take what works and yeah, take what works for you in this set of ideas and leave behind the ones that don't. And so we're going to say that Empire's rhythm is the thing that keeps us dancing or moving to the beat of the sad rhythm of individualism and abuse and dependence and depression. And part of what's happening is we're all told that we're like free to dance however we want, but the same shitty music is increasingly playing in most parts of the world. And the thing that is useful for me in thinking about rhythm is like when a song is playing really loudly, it's really hard to dance to a different beat, right? Where if you're trying to dance differently, but the music kind of catches your body and makes you move according to its own pattern. So, and then the other piece of this is that there's that kind of subtle ways in which we're made to move. And there's also a bunch of security guards ready to grab anyone who's too disruptive. So there is also physical force and violence, making sure that we keep dancing this way. And so how do you decompose empire? And I think here music is helpful again, because it's hard to drown out music with louder music or yelling. It's hard to like yell over the shitty music that's playing. And what happens then is you get noise, and it's hard to dance to that. Yeah.
Yeah, and to continue with that and just sort of swinging back, like empire is in within us too, and so sometimes we're conditioned and we learn that beat and those modes of oppressing ourselves and others. But one of the ways in which we could decompose empire together is we could find what's amplifying the music and unplug it. We could use disrupt it, we can interrupt it, in order to open up some space for our own ways of building and creating worlds. And this is what a lot of people are already doing and always have been done. This is through direct action and revolt. And it interrupts some of that music for some periods of time. It also explains why there's so much upwelling of communal support and collectivity after disaster. The music does get turned off. The state, the modes of empire usually wither away for a while. It stops, so people have some space to move, dance, and create together new ways of being.
And then we have this other idea that maybe we can be like noise canceling headphones. So, if we can't unplug empire and get to the amp and rip out the cord, maybe there's a way to tune into how empire is making us dance. And so I don't really know how noise canceling headphones work, but I think what I've been told is that like sound is a wave, and the noise canceling headphones basically listen, they hear the wave, and then they emit a different sound that it causes interference with that wave, and so it cancels the sound with more sound. But it has to be just the right frequency at just the right time, so those waves get broken down. And so these could be the spaces that people create together, where we are able to formulate problems together and support each other and transform the ways that we're living and feeling, even though the music is still playing in a lot of spaces around us.
Yeah, and just to sort of maybe nuance this or complicate it a bit, like I think one of the things we're up against, because with this loudness of socialization and the empire music noise, is if we like go into our smaller spaces and cut ourselves off with these noise canceling headphones, then we're not listening to each other. And I think listening is one of the best ways we could really interrupt listening to each other and listening to our own sounds and ideas. So I think this is a point of attention of like and we see this, how do we move together and really undo empire's hold on us, both internally and of course systemically.
So composing the future. We talked about decomposing. What does it mean to compose the future? Another way to ask that question is like, what do we do if we're trying to create something different? And what we called rigid radicalism in the book could be the tendency for me to want to play my music my way, right? So I've written the song, you guys, like, it's done, I figured it out. It's the best music, all of you are playing it wrong, or my collective has written the song, or my crew, or my platform, or my ideology has the right song, and you all haven't interpreted it right, or you messed up that note, or those other people play terrible music. And I might be right about a bunch of this, right? So it maybe the thing about music is there's ways to play music well, and maybe there's some pretty bad music out there, and it really is grating on people's ears. Like, maybe you really suck at playing the flute, but me yelling about it might not actually make the music any better. So that, I think that's another way that this whole music composition thing is helpful, is everything that we're doing is contributing to a soundscape, and my attack on your shitty music might make the soundscape even more claustrophobic. And it's definitely going to stifle the people who are just learning to play, who are just kind of like trying to get away from the Empire's sound and trying to, learn a new instrument. And yelling at the crappy flute player loses sight of this bigger problem, that there's some horrible droning elevator music that we're all subjected to. As people who are trying to create alternatives or get in the way of Empire, we're always making mistakes and always playing flat notes. But the real enemy is Empire itself. And that's where the really loud, horrible music is coming from.
Yeah, and so in keeping on that thread of composing new worlds and working together to undo Empire's hold on us, we really center this idea of asking questions of each other and being with people in the room, and that there's no blueprint. There's no like 10 steps towards building this new world, or to use the music metaphor, we're not going to take Nick's collective's song and add it to all our collectives on top of. So instead of this idea of composing songs together for others, it might be better to think of it as a kind of a jam session of I don't actually play an instrument, so I don't know what this means, but I live with a composer and a musician. And what I hear from them is that it's when it's most lively, when there's lots of listening and a lot of care and a lot of encouragement, a lot of magic happens. There's a lot of room for experimentation. There's a lot of room for joy. And so, yeah, we talk about this later on in the book, but this idea about attunement, being attuned to each other. And you see that when people are really listening and creating together, whatever it is. And it's the same with life. What we create together has to be a life we want, a way of living that feels more alive than the shitty patterns we're encouraged to repeat. So this idea of just constantly reworking and re-asking and checking in with each other about how it's going and how we're building these new worlds together, and getting under the holding of Empire on us.
Yeah, and in the book, we use this concept of common notions to try to think about how some musical combination works really well. And maybe we have an amazing jam session and we find eventually a way to have several and find some patterns to return to and play around with that keep us feeling alive and keep us feeling inventive, and like we're able to create something together. And that the word for that is a common notion. It's a way of playing well together or working well together or making music or whatever that evolves out of a relationship. And part of why it was useful for us is because it becomes rigid if we try to tell other people that they have to play the same way, or we try to institutionalize the way that we're playing. If we try to say, you know, this is what's worked for us, you should do the same thing, we convert common notions into something else, into a model, and people end up imitating an ideal. So they end up looking and saying, oh, those people play it that way, that's the way we should play it too, rather than working things out for themselves, rather than starting from their own jam session and figuring out like what works in our own context. And so, yeah, we really wanted to emphasize the beauty and importance from starting in your own situation with the relationships and the priorities and the values that people have, rather than kind of imitating a thing or looking to something else as the right way.
Yeah, and sort of riffing off of that, the book started with a bunch of conversations, and a lot of them were informal and in community and with our friends and comrades and people across distances. But there was a lot of people we interviewed directly, and one of the sort of common notions that ran through all those conversations was the idea of trust and responsibility, or the ability to respond. And so we really focused on those two common notions. And it was something, it is someone asked me the other day what ideas in the book really resonate still with me. And I would say those are the two. That idea of like that trust is kind of the foundation, the bedrock of any collective or community. And that ability to respond to each other's needs, to be responsive to each other, to listen, and also just nuancing that word. We had a few people pull it apart, responsibility. So some people just really looking at who can respond and who can't, and talking about that in a real way. And for me, like, I imagine a world where every relationship we had was reciprocal and consent-based instead of extractive and coercive, where trust and responsibility were the foundation in which we work from. I asked the question, what kind of community or world would we have if we really, I guess, animated this idea of trust and responsibility? I'm pretty sure we do almost a whole chapter on this, so I won't spend a ton of time on it, but I just wanted to share that there is a way to talk about, to provide a pathway. Like, one of the critiques of our book is that we don't provide a template on how to undo rigid radicalism. And that's intentional. That was intentional. We didn't do that intentionally, because then we would be telling you what song to write and sing and perform. But we do provide some pathways, and this is an example one. And we just really want to be upfront that it came out of conversations with hundreds of people. And it is the threads that really run through generative, transformative, joyful spaces and communities, is this idea of trust and responsibility. And this, is it okay? I just want to do a quick check-in. Should I go into more about the book, the making of the book?
Yeah.
One of the first questions we received, thank you very much, was why we did the book. We've kind of touched on that a bit, but it's important to note that this conversation started with Nick and I almost a decade ago, and it really took hold in 2013. Where we got a grant from IAS, thank you very much. And we were going to do an essay for their journal on perspectives. In that time, I actually joined the IAS, and Nick and I were really struggling with how enormous this conversation was becoming, because we interviewed about 7 people, and I was like, how do we amplify these voices and these ideas in a 3,000 word essay? So I pitched to IAS the book idea. We worked on it. in fits and starts. Nick was also doing his PhD. I was parenting. I was running a large social space. And so it took a few years. We finished it officially at the beginning of 2017. So to put some context, it was a few years ago. So things have changed. I'm not the book, Nick's not the book, we're not the ideas. The ideas are a bunch of other people's, and we just composed it, if you will. Just wanted to give that. But like I said earlier, it started with conversations. The term itself came out of me being interviewed for a film by Richard Day about the project Purple Thistle Center, which was a youth-run arts and activism center that Matt Hearn and 6 Youth started in 2001, and I became a director of. And I was telling him about just how the project works, and he said, it sounds like joyful militancy. And I went, what? That is going to be my word forever. I'm going to say it everywhere. And that was in 2010, I believe. So just to show how, or maybe 2011, but it's been a long time. And then the other piece was through these wonderful conversations. I wish I could name everybody because there's so many of you. And some of these conversations were people who are, long dead, like Spinoza and Nietzsche and other famous people, and Octavia Butler. But I really wanted to affirm, and so did Nick, that we were already doing a lot of this beautiful stuff. We were already asking questions. And of course, the Zapatistas is where we really pulled this idea of, as we walk, we ask questions. And we started articulating it as a kind of public secret. It was something that a lot of our friends and intimates and close collectives were having, this conversation of rigid radicalism and these ideas of stifling each other and feeling scared to talk publicly, why I wanted to, I'm just going to swing back to this idea of it being a decade old conversation, is that, of course, that's not true anymore. It isn't a public secret. It's very, 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 very out there, and this conversation is very public. But I wanted to point to that when we were first thinking about it and talking to people. It was very private. Yeah. Do you want to add to that, Nick?
Sure. Yeah. I think for me, the book evolved out of kind of meeting Carla. And so when I met, like maybe 11 years ago or something, I don't know, I think in 2010, I was a radical and an anarchist and involved in a lot of stuff. And I had a radical analysis, and I wanted to destroy all the systems of oppression. And I was good at saying all the right things and pointing at how other people were saying or doing things wrong. And I met Carla and other folks at the Purple Thistle, and they kind of like passed my radical test. So I was like, okay, they're good, they're radical, check mark. They're non-hierarchical, they're doing a actual youth-run long-standing project, which is, there's not actually many of those in North America. They're pretty overtly anti-capitalist, and were involved in like resisting the Olympics in 2010. So, I was like, okay, here's this cool radical project. I was looking for older mentors at the time. And so they were all of those things, but then also emphasized trust and friendship and generosity. And for me, that was kind of a bit mind-blowing, because I had thought of those previously as kind of hippie values. That's what hippies talk about, and serious radicals don't really value those things. And so that conversation kind of made me ask, well, I don't know, trust and friendship and generosity actually seem pretty important. And why don't I emphasize those? Like, why are the collectives that I'm part of not holding those up and trying to really put those at the center? And that is, for me, what kind of started this conversation of rigid radicalism. And that was like kind of a process of self-diagnosis for me. Like, I was trying to shed it as we were talking about it. But Yeah, that and from there the conversation evolved, and we talked to a whole bunch of people about it.
Sorry, I got pulled into reading questions. I'm going to take Suzanne's advice and not read them until after we get through these questions. Yeah, so, and this was, so just for people maybe who just joined, I'm not sure how it's going, but we're reading questions that were given to us ahead of time and then trying to answer them. So here's a question. In the spirit of walking and questioning, how do you feel about joyful militancy today?
Yeah, I still like our book, but I think one thing that I didn't anticipate and that I do feel I'm kind of questioning now is I think we spend a lot of time being like, this is what joy means, this is what militancy means, joyful militancy, new concept, here you go. And I think I was overconfident in the idea that we could just like change what words mean. But I learned in the process of writing the book and then in conversations with lots of people before and after that like words mean things and that it's really hard to make them mean something different. And so taking a term like joy or militancy and trying to put a different spin on it when it has so many kind of like resonances already attached to it is a really big project. And so, yeah, I might use some different words to describe some of the stuff that we're talking about.
Yeah, that speaks to me too. I think for me, just sort of riffing off that, I was asked to do a what's that called? Like a spoken word with music with Scott Crow's project in the fall. And I said, I just want to do it so that I can really, really hammer that joy doesn't mean happiness. And that was my goal and what I did for it. And so I feel like that's still my cause. And my relationship with joy, politicizing joy as a radical idea actually goes back over 20 years for me. I really politicized it. I was reading Spinoza at the time, and alongside Spinoza, I was reading The Dispossessed, which if you read that book from Ursula Le Guin, the way that she talks about joy is the way that we talk about it in the book. And it's this idea that, joy has sharp edges. And I think the thing I would change, and I've talked about this on a few podcasts, is I would call the book Militant Joy, because to me, joy is the point. And people who have read the book have reflected back that, yeah, that makes much more sense. It's like, but anyway, it's, and like I said, I would, of course, lots of things have changed, but I've already spoke to what the things that really resonate still is the ideas of friendship and freedom, the ideas of I think trust in the common notions, but the other piece too is, and I think I've been thinking about it more deeply and trying to talk about it more, is the ways in which rigid radicalism gets stoked in our communities. And so we point to a couple different things. And this is going to lead into the next question. So maybe I'll pause there because I think I'm going to answer it there.
So the next question is, personally, what do you struggle with in terms of rigid radicalism? Carla, you're muted.
Classic. Sorry. I wanted to talk about, I was really excited about this question because it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. I think it's kind of my new public secret that I want to talk about. And this is the idea that I think that for a lot of us, and I think that at schooling and competition and empire, all this shittiness under empire forces us not to be public about this because it means being vulnerable. And shout out to everyone who does be public about this. But I think a lot of the times the stuff that we're most oriented towards to talk about and to perhaps, quote unquote, preach are often the things that us ourselves need to work on. That like it's actually where we're stuck, or where what's holding us back from thriving and having a joyful life and connecting. At the end of the day, it really all comes down to like a feeling of belonging. And so for me, as I tend towards purity, and one of the things I preach is this idea of working across difference. And I don't, and for me, I'm talking about values. So not, so just thinking about neighbors and people like that are in my orbit. Like for me, if they don't share the values of trusting each other and being radically generous, I have a hard time staying in relationship with that person. And I feel like I would like these conversations to happen more publicly of where we're stuck individually, especially more public people who are talking to the world through different modes. Because I personally feel a bit gaslit by people who are preaching constantly, but I see that they too are struggling. And I would just like them to say, hey, I struggle with this too. Some humility and vulnerability. And like I said, shout out to everyone who does this already, because I know there's lots of you who do, but this is just something I've been thinking a lot about. And I am gonna, if you just bear with me real quick, a quote from Nietzsche, who I think summed it up for me on this idea of purity and where it gets seated. He wrote, "The surest way to corrupt a youth is to instruct him to hold in higher esteem those who think alike than those who think differently." And I think like, I think it'd be hard pressed to find anyone who didn't say, oh yeah, I had that pushed into me really early on. And you can even think about it like how in school we're put in an age group, right? Even that is like a not working cross difference. And so, yeah, I'm not being hard on myself. I'm curious about it. I'm curious why I struggle here. And I'm trying to be more public about that I struggle here.
Yeah, I think for me, I think I have a similar struggle, but I think my purity tendency is specifically about rigid radicalism. Like, you would think that after writing a book about rigid radicalism, that you would be more open and more, kind of have a more sense of ease working through it. But I found, especially right after writing the book, I think because we spent so much time writing about it and thinking about it and being like, how does this rigid radicalism manifest? I was so allergic to any instance of what I perceived as rigid radicalism. And at the same time as recognizing that it's something that I am still working through and have worked through. And a friend calls it ex-smoker syndrome. So like, you try to quit smoking, or you succeed at quitting smoking, and then you're just like, cigarettes are the most disgusting, vile things ever. And you hate cigarettes more than people who never smoked. And I think I can sometimes have that relationship to rigid radicalism of still, if I have like really sharp ideological pointy bits, one of them continues to be that I do struggle with especially certain manifestations of rigidity. It's kind of like and we were trying to really ward that off in the book, of not trying to stigmatize rigid radicalism and say the last thing we want is to say, here's another bad thing that people are doing, that you should get mad at people for doing badly. But yeah, I get mad sometimes about it. So that's something I struggle with.
Thank you, whoever asked that question. That was great. I just wanted to take a quick moment to people who are listening and sticking around. Thank you so much. I know this can be really tiring. I really appreciate you being here. So the next question is, what do you imagine as some first steps to support a fellow activist in shifting from a rigid radical to a joyful militant ethos? How can we engage with community members and friends when they are deep, deep in this rigid radical phase?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on relationships and context. And in a way, that's kind of a cop-out answer of like, well, it really depends. It's, it's just really complicated. But I think it's true. It's really true in the sense of like when I encountered this question, I was like, well, who am I to this person? Am I a mentor? Am I a best friend? Am I like somebody who I'm just getting to know them? Am I a lover? What are we to each other? And I think asking that question and then asking like, then how can I get in there with them? Is a really important piece. And yeah, and I think it ultimately it's that kind of like jam session thing of there's no like song sheet to be like, here's how you fix a rigid radical. Because the whole idea of fixing is the part of the problem, and that it's really comes back to the jam session thing of like, well, you play together and find something that works. I think for me, at the time in my life when I was trying to undo that thing, it was crucial for me to recognize it myself and see it as something that I wanted to undo rather than having somebody else like tell me about it and me being like, oh, right, I need to work on that. That's another badness that I need to, purify myself of. And yeah, for me, having mentors like Carla who were clearly radical but also embodied other values was important.
Yeah, I think just adding to that, I think, and we speak about this in the book, that you need a place, you need your people who you can vent with and be angry and be mad about the liberal who irritates you constantly, or whatever, right? Like, I think it's okay to have those. That all feelings are okay. I mean, not all it's when it turns into action and you write about it when it becomes maybe potentially harmful and toxic. But you need to talk about it, and you need a safe space to talk about it, and that's usually in our most intimate relationships, and so cultivating and building those few people who really trust and see you, and allow you to kind of show your shadow side, your dark side, because I think what happens if we pretend it's not there, like that's how empire works. That's empire outplay. That is outside of this dynamic. It's bigger than us. It's through schooling. It's through moralism. It's through ideology. It's through competition, comparison, all the ways in which we're socialized. And that's going to come up. We're going to feel scarcity. We're going to feel shame. We're going to feel these feelings, and it can become sedimented and rigid. And to just pretend it's not there and say you have it all figured out, I think that's the most dangerous place to be. So I think also just it comes back to listening, right? And hearing and providing a safe space for someone to, I like what Nick said about it. It's the composition. It depends on the relationship, on how you hold that space, and who you're willing to listen to, so for example, as a white older woman, like, other white older women who maybe are not getting some things about maybe trans stuff or whatever, I maybe would be, as a cis woman, would be a good person for that person to talk to, just to give a really concrete example. But a cis white dude dealing with his patriarchy in a really intense way, maybe I shouldn't be the one who listens to that, and so on and so forth. Yeah, I hope that's helpful. I'm asking the next question. How do your ideas relate to the yippies of the 60s and onward? the late 60s and onward.
Yeah, this is one of those like social movement history questions that makes me feel like I should know more about social movement history, because I don't know that much about the Yippies. But my understanding is that their thing was about making politics into a way of life, and that like it's about living your values in your whole being and questioning the ways that like our whole lives are structured by empire, and we should therefore try to live differently here and now. And they were doing that and saying that at a time when there were a lot of programs and parties and formulas for political change. And so I think that's a connection that I would see. Is I see us and the book that we wrote as part of that current that runs through the Yippies and into people like post-structuralists and new social movements of the 70s and 80s, and the Zapatistas, like Carla mentioned, and a lot of anarchist currents too, that are really trying to say that it's crucial to think, when we think about what is to be done or politics or whatever, that we should question our whole lives and the ways that we're living. And yeah, I think that's the piece that, or that's the connection that I would make.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little fun fact about Yippies in connection to the Purple Thistle Center. A playwright in Vancouver, forgive me, I've forgotten his name and the name of the play, but you could probably Google it. He was a former Yippie, and he reached out to us at the Purple Thistle because he felt there was a similarity between the work they did and the work we did. And he wrote the play and workshopped it with us. And he even wrote a song about the Purple Thistle and our guerrilla gardening and radical art. And yeah, I think, you know, that idea of art and activism, that intersection is what I would say is what is at play that animates throughout our book. This idea of like creating together, working together, you know, cultivating and allowing joy to flow and thriving to happen. And for me, like some of the currents that would also run through that is, you know, the kind of punk and cyberpunk, the idea of like, you know, the misfits, the outcasts, the outsiders, subculture kind of movements that run through there. Because the Yippies were, I think it's different. The Yippies were quite different in Vancouver, in Canada, versus maybe some of the groups in the US. But again, I'm not up on entirely, but yeah. Hope that was what you were looking for.
So the next question is, I'm curious if y'all have ideas about where outdated books and social transformation or revolution, or sorry, outdated books on or about social transformation or revolution belong. I'm caught between not wanting to reproduce any harm within these books, but I also want to acknowledge their role in the process of social transformation or revolution. Is there a way to do both? What do y'all think?
Before I answer that, I said I wouldn't get distracted by questions, but I just saw one saying, "What is a yippie?" I wouldn't even know what the definition off the top of my head is. Do you know, Nick?
Pass.
Pass, sorry. I mean, they were playing off of hippie, obviously. And yeah, like what Nick was saying, I think they were trying to, my understanding is that they were much more overtly political in the intersections of like anti-racism and other issues, and not just, you know, love and peace, anti-war. They were incorporating a lot of other things. Anyway, so back to this question. Thank you for this question. I'm not going to lie. We both said we could do a whole live stream on this question. So I'm going to try to, maybe I said that, but I'm going to try to keep it contained. It's just a lot to think about. I also want to say it's one of these questions that would be a better conversation, I think, asking for some clarity. And it seems like you have a lot, whoever asked this has been thinking about it, and I would like to hear more of your thinking. But first off, I really like history. And I really like to amplify and hold up voices and movements and people who came before, particularly people who maybe weren't centered. And I'm very allergic to erasure. So I think that stuff that's come before, while in its time and space, maybe all of it wouldn't fit in today's thinking and culture and movements, because it would be outdated in some ways, or even potentially problematic. I think that, to use the cliche, like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Our book is based off of an old dead white philosopher. Like, at the core of it is Spinoza, and then the sort of marginalized philosophical current that sprung from him. And what we tried to do was decenter the kind of rationalist white man philosopher and incorporate a lot of other voices of less heard. Again, it comes back to composition. I think, when you think about, who was it? It was one of those liberal philosophers at the turn of the last century, said that all music has been created. It's all being composed. There's nothing new. So this was like in the late 1800s. And then, that's not true. But there's elements of it that are true, right? Like there's chords, there's I'm not a musician. I should not be taking this metaphor on. But I think you get to my point, is that I think I jokingly said that I was going to write a pamphlet about all the philosophers who were shitty to kids, who had terrible positions on children. And I'm going to out them all. But and Hannah Arendt is one of the worst. P.S. F her all the way. But she's really held up, right? So do we just completely throw her out? No. Well, some people might say yes, but my point is that I think there's a lot of nuance to here, and I feel like, I could go on forever about this. But I think I'm going to leave it there, because I bet you Nick has a lot to say about it.
Yeah, I think what do I think? I guess I teach at a university. I'm like a gig economy worker in the university, and I love doing theory with students and doing theory with other people too. And I think one of the tendencies that I see in universities, especially among students who are becoming radicalized, is really being attuned to things in books that are problematic and wanting to kind of push away the whole book or the whole author or the whole current because of the problematic thing. And I guess, yeah, for me, I guess one take is, well, everything is problematic. We're mired in shit right now. We live in empire. We're living in a nightmare. There is no pure idea that's unproblematic. But I think there's something really beautiful in people taking on a book that is complex, that has some ideas where you're like, oh, fuck no, not that, but maybe this, and taking it apart with people and asking, okay, they hold this position and that is pretty hateful or pretty exclusive of this group, or ends up in this shitty form of politics, or they ended up supporting these people who were pretty horrible, and asking, well, okay, well, what are the implications of that, right? Does it undermine other parts of their work? How and why, and how is it all connected? And yeah, really kind of tackling those questions of how do you pull in the parts that resonate or make sense or are useful, and push away other parts. And I think having trust in people's capacity and in our collective capacity to do that together is one piece that feels important to me. And another thing is I actually also think it's really important to read our enemies, like the biggest pieces of shit, and understand their logic and how what they wrote animates so much of today. Like I teach John Locke in one of my classes. He's like a slave-holding capitalist piece of shit that invented the justification for private property. But we should know that. Like we should know how his idea that like you turn a piece of land into a farm and you get to steal it from indigenous people, how that still animates the world in really important ways. So I think reading our enemies is important. And I also think there's also a kind of like taking an old book or an outdated book or an idea that hasn't seen the light in a while and putting it into a new context might be exactly what we need in certain spaces. So there might be something really good about the fact that it's outdated, about the fact that it's not being read or discussed, or even that it, like there's some trickiness to reading it in a new context. And so I think, yeah, there's a way to kind of think about it as a process of experimentation that in spaces where we're often with people who really share the same values as us and have a lot of the same assumptions, reading somebody who's way off in a different direction could be really exactly what we need to challenge ourselves.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for people sending live questions. We will try to get to them. Just on the side, Nick, there's a really good one at the very first one you might want to answer. How do you deal with the tension between the desire to end suffering on a large scale versus creating other worlds? So this idea of what I perceive, and I definitely have this conversation with a lot of fellow radicals and friends, is this idea of like it's a tension on the left, right? The so-called left of, the work I'm doing, it ends suffering for way more people now. And you're too busy trying to prefigure and create alternatives, and you're not actually helping enough people in the moment. And there's a tension there. And so that's how I read that question. So I'll read it again for you, Nick. How do you deal with the tension between the desire to end suffering on a large scale versus creating other worlds?
Yeah, I think I'm definitely someone on the, if there's a spectrum or something, I tend towards the creating of other worlds. And I think one way into that is like, I think I would challenge a little bit the idea of ending suffering, and ask what it entails, like what people mean. And because I think part of it is that what people implicitly mean is bringing people into a standard of living that is basically an industrialized Western middle-class existence. And that living a subsistence life, for example, is seen as suffering. So often, especially in dominant order, but I think in lots of social movement-y spaces too, farmers in India are talked about living mere subsistence, right? And there's this idea that they need to be brought out of that and brought into selling for the market or something, which in other ways is way more precarious. People are then detached from where their food comes from and the skills that they need to grow their own food. And so I think that it tweaks the idea of what we mean by ending suffering on a large scale and what we mean by creating other worlds. And another way to run it or spin it, I think, is to say that a lot of those standards of living, so like I'm one of the people who grew up living a standard of living that other people are supposed to want to be raised into, like a middle-class existence in the suburbs. and there is a sense of security and ease and all that comes along with it, but a lot of those a lot of that form of life is also really stifling to people, and that's by design. And so, like, Silvia Federici talks about how the suburbs were actually very intentionally built in a way to individualize people, that everyone's going to go home from work in their own car, and they're going to go in their own garage, and then they're going to mow their own backyard. And that's all by design. That's so that people aren't living together and working together and communing together. And I think that creating other worlds actually puts people often in a situation that is more precarious and more risky, but is also more has more potential. And so, yeah, I guess I would just want to mess around a little bit with like the tension, or that they're separate. And one of the ideas that we explored in the book is that power or empire or whatever is increasingly built into the infrastructure of our lives, that we can say as much as we want about how capitalism is really bad. And I think increasingly, even in the past year under COVID, I see like it's becoming easier and easier to name capitalism as the force that is destroying everything. There's almost like, CBC is talking about it. Mainstream media is talking about capitalism as this force that's destroying the world. And yet, capitalism or empire doesn't actually require that we like it or that we say it's good. It just requires us to be dependent on its infrastructure. It needs us to need capitalism and all the other forms of oppression for our shelter and our food and our everyday life. And as long as we need those things, it doesn't really matter how loudly we complain. And so that there's something really potentially subversive in people finding ways to detach their dependence on empire.
Yeah, I'm going to bring in a question that, so for the book, we interviewed Marina Citrin, and she was, has always brought such clarity and asked us such good questions, because she does that. But in the last year, I started a podcast called Silver Threads with Eleanor Goldfield, and which is following a lot of the threads that are in the book of Joyful Militancy. But we had Marina on, and she asked us a question, which has become this kind of foundational question for the show ever since. And the answers have been so illuminating and exciting. And I think it connects to why I brought it up, is it connects. And the question was, why haven't we scaled over, and why haven't we destroyed capitalism, growing mutual aid in this past year of the big unveiling of, like Nick just said, like most people now go, whoa, yeah, capitalism is bad. And mutual aid is really showing up. Everyone's talking about mutual aid now. But we haven't really scaled it over. And scaled over to me is like, horizontally and warding off hierarchy. So not scaled up, not that capitalistic term, but scaling over. And one of the things that she said was that maybe we're afraid of our own power, our collective power. And it does kind of connect to that, that power is so in the hands of empire and the institutions that run our lives, from, to use an Illich term, like radical monopoly on our lives. Like it's when we go to the washroom, right? The state controls that. It's everywhere. The food, the childcare, everything. And a lot of that's being closed off because of COVID. So, so why can't we push it? And in lots of ways people are, and there's been lots of incredible uprisings in the last year, but it's not really. Capitalism is going well, still, despite all this. And one of the, for me, my answer immediately was, well, because I'm working class. My partner works 40 hours a week in a working class job, and we have housing precarity. We've moved twice since the pandemic started. It's hard for me to scale over. I can only do so much. I have to tend to my own survival, my family's and my friends' survivals. And that's, again, empire at play. And, Yeah, and I think I'm gonna share one of Ashante Alston's answer to the question, because it's the one that really I've been thinking about a lot, and I want to share it with all of you. Is he pointed to the idea of American exceptionalism as a reason why we're not scaling over, and have never. He was part of the Black Panthers and Black nationalism, and was a political uh, prisoner and an anarchist. And he, yeah, this idea that social change, like the undoing of capitalism, can happen without any violence. A belief that America is the one place that can have the so-called revolution without any violence. And this idea of you can't, like, no, any violence is bad violence. And his argument, and like a lot of Black folks and BIPOC folks like to point to, is there's already a lot of violence. Look at the numbers of people who have died from COVID in the US. Look at the people who are dying from poverty. Look at the Black people who are being killed, and the list goes on. So it's like he feels that's the thing that gets in the way, and I'm still sitting with it. I think it's powerful, and Canada is right there with them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I have a good answer to this question. I wish we could ask everyone on this thing and have a circle and people say what they think. I mean, as an anarchist, I think bureaucracy and reform are incredible traps for people's energy. And like where I used to live in Victoria, I just knew so many people who would spend like hundreds of hours campaigning to get someone elected, and they would succeed at electing somebody to be part of a minority party who would then have no power to change anything, and they would yell in a room full of other people wearing suits. Like that was the thing. And I would often just imagine of like, what if those thousands of hours were spent doing, like, creating mutual aid projects, or rebuilding the social fabric that's being destroyed, or defending people from eviction, or other kinds of direct action that is often seen as kind of ineffective or small scale. But if all of the people that were doing more reformist things were involved in that, I think it could potentially scale over.
Yeah, that was one of my answers. Imagine if all the people who were lobbying the state actually turned to each other. We'd get a lot done. Yeah. The next question came over Twitter, actually. Thank you. What are practices that build trust between people that the state is actively trying to divide? For example, in cases where only some members of a collective have the legal authority to sign leases and contracts. Yeah, and just a little housekeeping thing. We only have, after this one, there's only 2 more questions, and we'll I think we might have time to answer a couple.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. Like, I take it to be a question about, like, how do you use something like a nonprofit structure or some other legal structure where there's a formal collective and people are in those kind of formal roles of, like, they're on the board of directors or whatever. And I think, in my experience, that one of the most important things is to, and the way that I like to work with those structures, is to make a pretty rigid distinction between, like, who we are to each other as a collective or group of people working together, and who we are to the state, and not to let those become the same. So, like, I've been part of collectives where we're technically a nonprofit society so that someone will lease us a building, or so that we could apply for a grant or something. And certain people have their names down on paper as the leaseholders, or they're on the board of directors or whatever. but we, as much as possible, are kind of just like, that's like a performance that we act out for the state once a year. You know, you have to have an AGM. You don't even have to have an AGM. You have to say that you had one. You have to have minutes that recorded it, right? And I think the insidious part is when those things get conflated and people start to believe that I really have to act like I'm a board member, and you really have to act like you're not a board member. And we get stuck in those roles rather than making other relationships with each other, and not getting sucked into the kind of professional or legalistic roles. So like I was reading about the Zona Défense in France the other day. And for people who don't know, it's this long-standing space where people successfully stopped an airport, and they resisted several waves of the state coming in and destroying houses and buildings and farmland, and created this massive, like I think it's over 400 hectares of land, of collectively run farms and homes, and it was a real experiment in non-hierarchical living. And one of the things that the state is trying to do now is get them to sign leases, individual leases with individual people attached to it, in order to create divides and make some property owned by someone and not communal. And what the person who I was reading said is like, yeah, we signed those things, but we have our own pacts and our own agreements and our own like ways that we live with each other, and all that other shit is just stuff on paper. And so I think yeah, making sure to keep alive or reinvent or re-enliven the fact that we can kind of make our own ways of living and deciding and being responsible to each other, and holding that at a distance from the state ways of deciding. And I would acknowledge that it's really difficult. Like for myself, and I think for lots of other people who've been raised without knowing how to deal with really intense conflict, or how to live communally, or how to make really big decisions outside of a family, of how you're going to organize your lives and what you're going to share. All that stuff's really hard. And so I don't think there's an easy solution, but I think there's a really important political horizon in people learning how to do all that stuff and keeping the state at a distance.
Yeah, and just to for transparency, the person who asked, they asked because of the work I did at the Purple Thistle, which of course really had this dynamic. And you know, like before I go and get into that, like transformation is messy, as long as we're particularly like, it just is. It's like giving birth, as a former guest, Ariel, said on Silver Threads. You know, we're trying to birth new worlds here. It's messy. And alongside that, we're still under empire. So there's compromises. And I think the biggest thing for me is it actually comes back to those common notions, those ideas of trusting and listening to each other, and deinstitutionalizing. And the way that Nick said it is great, so I won't go into that. But that idea of like really coupling off and decentering those roles, because the state's going to make it like it's a really powerful role and it's an important role, but we as a collective can decide that it's not. So for instance, at the Purple Thistle, yeah, either Matt or I signed the lease. Like the landlord wasn't going to lease to a bunch of youth. We had to sign off on grants, or a board member had to sign off on grants. But the youth who ran the space, they did run the day-to-day operations, like, which is actually how the space functioned. So it was the power was there. And we just tried to be transparent about it as much as you can, and talk about power and how power moves and shifts and changes. And it's not just this one top-down institutional power, which is what we're trained to think. It's, you know, it's relational, it ebbs, it flows, there's social power. And yeah, just not gaslighting about it, and being really upfront and using it as a tool to to do the cool work. Like it was a payoff. It was more important to have a space that could remain free and be used by people outside of the collective, other groups, other organizations, to cause trouble in the city. I mean, the city used to call me up and say, "You guys are a pain in the ass. Like, we give you money, and then you're the ones out here doing shit to us." It's like, yeah, well, that's great. That's exactly what we're here for. So the payoff, it worked, right? And yeah, and then just to quickly bring it into the home, like this is something I obviously care about in terms of sharing power in the home, across age difference. When you're parenting or living with younger folks, even if they're not your children, it's the same conversations, right? Like, who decides where you live especially in a city that housing is hard, your kids can't go and sign the lease. So just trying to really think about it, how maybe you can radicalize those relationships across different places, even in the private home, is maybe a way to think about it.
Okay. Our next question is, how can joy be enhanced at times of distress and anxiety in social movements?
Make things together. Like, just get busy, create things. And I don't mean just art, because obviously not everyone plays music. But start a garden project together, a land project together, just create and get busy. I think one of the things where joy gets thwarted is that there's a tendency for social spaces and larger social movements. And I'm not talking about the intimate spaces that we create with our intimates and our close collectives. I'm talking about the larger public social movements, is to spend too much time, non-consensually, I may add, doing kind of what my son calls the tyranny of the round, and trying to, talk deeply about everything that's coming up in a way that privileges a few and really hurts a lot of people in the group. And I think, I went right to how joy gets ruined. But yeah, and I think, eating together, breaking bread together, inviting people across your threshold, right? Like, these are the ways. I mean, joy, I think, comes most alive when we feel connected and we feel like we belong and we feel heard and listened to. And so it's actually quite like there's actually quite an active response. I know we talk a lot about the joy, you can't hold it down, you can't pin it down, it moves, it has sharp edges, it emerges in the most delightful times. You can't hold it and keep it, but you can nurture it, you can cultivate a way for, I always connect joy and thriving together, because I think thriving is kind of the outgrowth of a moment of joy, and that is the thing that you can keep cultivating. So yeah, make things together, do things, keep busy.
Yeah, Carla said all of this stuff.
And rest. Listen to kids. Somebody asked me, like, how do you not get burnt out and exhausted? And I'm like, I think from working and hanging out with kids a lot and doing projects with younger people, is kids just instinctively know when to take a break. Like, they know when to rest. They play hard, they go hard, they're like joyful, they let it flow, they let their feelings flow. Yeah, just trust kids.
That's a good one. Yeah, I think I don't have much more to say. I really like a lot of those answers, and I think food, like having food most of the time in collective spaces, is really wonderful. And yeah, I think one of the things about joy is that it comes through feeling more capable. And so asking, like, well, what are things that do make us feel more capable? Like, are there skills that we can build together, new things that we can learn, or things that we can do that create a concrete sense of, like, wow, we actually just like accomplished something tangible, when things are feeling like kind of despairing, or we can't create anything, or we can't win anything. Yeah. And the last question that we had from things that people sent in is, are you two working on anything together? Carla? You're muted.
The chat box was in front of it. I couldn't see. I just maybe I'll start answering this, and maybe you can read a couple of the questions, Nick. See if
I can't actually figure out. I see a chat, but I can only see one thing.
The Q&A. It's Q&A next to share screen. Okay,
I'm exposing my computer ineptitude here in front of people, but
okay, I'll read them in a second.
Okay.
We won't go too long on this question. Yeah, so during the Thistle days when we were collaborating together and working on things, one of the issues that kept coming up at the Thistle for some of us who live in housing precarity and the collective themselves was that housing was an issue. So it was really great that we had this free, accessible, radical space that we could go to, but so many of our community members were being pushed out of the city because they couldn't afford to live here anymore. So it got us thinking and talking about and researching and visiting all these radical, cool housing projects. We visited a few in Seattle and other places, and it just started becoming a conversation with me and my friends. Even outside of the Thistles, it flowered out, and it's something that I kept bringing to Nick, and you know, Chris is my partner, and we talk often about that. You know, we're just on the verge of being pushed out of the city all the time. So we started working on a project a couple of years ago called Solidarity Housing, which I'm going to let Nick talk about more because it was really his idea at the foundation of it. And then the other thing we're starting is starting a pamphlet series called Lowercase. And it's amplifying kinetic ideas, and Nick is going to be supporting that, but he also is going to do a series of pamphlets for that. My partner and I have a project we're launching called Listening House Media, which is multifaceted, but there's a little micro publishing part to it.
Yeah. The idea for solidarity housing, I mean, I guess the context is especially where I used to live in Victoria on Lekwungen Saanich territory, and Carla, like she mentioned, lives in Vancouver, and those are some of the most rapidly gentrifying places in North America. And demographically, part of what's happening is there are all these older kind of baby boomer generation folks who they own their own house, a lot of them. So a lot of them are middle class, but they bought a house 20 or 30 or 40 years ago when the housing market wasn't what it is now. And so they might have paid like $50,000 or something, and they paid off their mortgage. A lot of them don't have kids. And now some of these people are like, they are one or two older people living in a huge house that's worth like $1 or $2 or $3 or $5 million. And the conversations that we've been having is, you know, there's one way to look at it that says these rich people have benefited from housing and now they're millionaires and like, yay for them, sucks for the rest of us. And I think that's kind of the dominant narrative, is like, some people are rich, good for them, and then the rest of us are just resent those people and think that they're pretty shitty for having $1 million house. And the conversations that we were having is a lot of these people, they don't actually need $4 million, and they also don't want their neighborhood to become a gentrified, sad, shitty condo land. And so there are lots of people who own property in Canada and in the US who, you know, they kind of like got into the middle class property dream. But now the thing that's happening to the middle class property dream is it's being hollowed out, and the neighborhoods that were once kind of like pretty diverse and had working class folks and middle class folks are now being increasingly hyper gentrified and turning into shiny condos, and the people who actually own the property they don't have a lot of ways to actually prevent that from happening, right? And so you can give your house to charity when you die, but even if you give your house, like a lot of people set that up, and then the organization that they give it to just sells it as an asset and uses the money. So like, nice that you did something, but it doesn't actually change the way that doesn't actually change what's happening to the neighborhood where you live. Or they can rent out part of their house cheaply and be like kind of kind landlords. And, you know, that does things. And I've definitely benefited from having kind landlords who charge below market rent. But it doesn't actually change the situation, the like structural precarity situation for renters who are, if you're a renter in these cities, you are basically kind of always in a situation of precarity because your house could always be rent evicted or demolished or whatever, like what just happened to Carla and their family. And so the thing that we're starting with a conversation where we're trying to talk to property owners about like, well, what if you could do something else with your property? And most of these folks, like, we're not trying to talk to billionaires. We're trying to talk to people who, you know, were like a teacher or some other middle-class job. They managed to get a property, they paid off a bunch of their mortgage, and for them, their house is their kind of nest egg, like it's their only asset. So they can't just give it away. And they're hoping to like downsize. And we're trying to say, well, what if instead of just cashing out and putting your millions of dollars in stocks or something creepy like that, what if you could transition ownership of your house to a nonprofit, and new people would get to rent it, and they would get to have kind of the stability of knowing that it's a nonprofit, permanently affordable house, and you would get a bit of that money because you transitioned your house and you want to feel secure in like retirement or whatever. And so it's kind of trying to have a conversation about how could people think about property and class differently, and how could we have like real meaningful solidarity across class in relation to property ownership. What could that look like? And in a way that isn't trying to like shame property owners for owning property, because I think we're trying to just be pragmatic about it and say, you know, you lucked into this thing and you want to contribute to your neighborhood and stop it from being just a bunch of yuppies. And how do you do that? How could we create a way for you to like leverage what you have to support other people? And so the kind of technical part is we hired a consultant to help us to make a transaction mechanism. But basically the idea is that for people who are interested, ownership of their house transitions to a nonprofit or a community land trust, and the homeowner gets some monthly payments, and new people move in and they pay rent at an affordable rate, and it creates stability, hopefully, for everyone. And so that project is going to be launching in the next couple of months, and we're going to be to start with just talking to homeowners about what they think about the idea. And then if there are people who want to try, then we're going to try out some pilot projects out here on the West Coast in Canada.
Yeah, we have a little animation explaining it that will be up in a couple weeks, and check it out. It's pretty exciting. There's one of the pilots is more in the vein of reparations or land back for Indigenous people here. So people who want to be like actively doing it for that reason. And then of course, other modes of solidarity for newcomers and working class folks. Yeah. So I grabbed 3 questions for you, Nick. I don't know if I know we're running a little bit later than I think we want to do, just an hour and a half, but if you wanted to answer one of those, or I could read them.
Yeah, sure. Why don't you pick your fave?
Well, real quick, why don't you read these two, and I'll just answer this one on childhood.
Okay.
Somebody asked, do you know if someone who has written on childhood from an anarchist perspective? Yeah, I have. And there's a lot of people out there, and but Matt Hearn probably has the most amount. I was trying to think of, there's a lot of good books that have come out. PM Press has a book that just came out called Raising Free Children. I've forgotten her first name, Richards, a Black woman in the US, and it's just fabulous. It's so good. I don't know if she identifies or they identify as an anarchist. So just keeping it more to your question, definitely check out Matt Hearn's books. Everywhere All the Time is a really good one. Deschooling Society. Yeah, there's lots of connections out there. I can put it in the comments maybe after. And I have a book coming out with AK Press. It's an anthology next year called Trust Kids. Solidarity Begins at Home, and looking at the private lives as radicals and anti-authoritarians on how we have relationships with young people in our homes. Yeah.
Cool. I like these other 2 questions. Do you want to pick one, or do you want me to ask one?
I will ask the first one to you. When we're jamming together and building new mutual relationship protocols, with empire and violence being so pervasive and hard to uproot in what we have been taught individually and how to treat others, what are some ways that we can identify those sour off-key notes when making our own music? Love the metaphor.
Yeah, cool question. I love when people take metaphors and keep going with them. I mean, the same thing that we have been saying. I think it depends on the relationship and the context and all that. I think for me, on both sides of like when I play sour notes and when I'm trying to let other people know about that, it has been really important for me to do it one-on-one and outside of the public world for it to be effective. And when, like, yeah, I guess it depends again. Like when I think of the way that people have challenged me, you know, I totally don't mind if I'm in a big group and people are like, Nick, you're taking up a lot of space. It's time to stop now. Like, okay, so sorry. That's a tendency that I have, is talk a lot. But if it's like something that's a bit more close to my heart or complex and relational, or like I've hurt someone, or it's a really long-standing thing, then I think, yeah, finding time and space to connect with a person outside of the public thing or the broader collective thing or whatever it is. And Carla already mentioned this, but I also think it can be important, or it can be really helpful to have people who have a similar life experience. So like when I am doing patriarchal shit and silencing people or not able to be in contact with my emotions or whatever, it helps me to be able to talk to other men who are socialized similarly and are struggling with the same stuff. Maybe I can read this.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. It's great.
The next question is, Thank you both for this event and to those organizing. Any thoughts on how we can create a culture of vulnerability and accountability in a punitive world? How do we approach conflict in a generative way?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've slowly or subtly talked about it. And it's, it's a big conversation because, quote unquote, call out culture is just getting bigger and bigger online. And so how do you be vulnerable when you're scared of being called out or called in? I read a thing the other day of someone saying it's not cancel culture, it's consequence culture. And I really love that because it's true. Like more and more people are being put on, are being called in about their behavior. And I think that's okay. But the question is like, how can you tend to and attune into those relationships when someone has made a mistake or harmed others? And I think this is a really long answer. And we try to tackle it a bit in the book about, this idea of sitting, going towards trouble and not ignoring. And it comes back to transparency and pointing out and talking about and not gaslighting. Yeah, I mean, we all have the cop in our head, right? A little bit, and to pull on Foucault. And so it's one of the things that I have been most frustrated with as an organizer, and has actually made me want to leave many times, is the replication of that kind of punitive nature. And it starts in the home. And this is why I'm doing the book, right? Where the kid gets sent in a timeout. I mean, it's replicating some really insane, or not insane. Sorry for using that word. It's quite ableist. It's replicating some really toxic ways that connect right up to prisons. And so it really starts in our most intimate relationships, I think, on how we connect and create an environment where people feel heard and trusted and listened to so that they can show up being their full selves. And I think it comes back to what Nick was saying about it depends on the composition of the relationships and who you're willing to do that accountability work with. And there's so much good work out there. There's so many good books and pieces written and hot takes on this conversation that goes beyond my capacity. I think right now we're coming into almost an hour and 45 minutes. So I'm going to leave it there. Nick, did you want last thoughts before we say goodbye?
No, I think that's a good place to end.
Thank you all for being here. Reach out to us and keep the conversation going.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And I just pasted that link in case people are joining late. We are supporting a fundraiser for the Montegilla Rematriation Project. And if you want to make a donation to that, there's a link in the chat. So thanks again to everyone for all the questions and for coming out.